Flight attendant humiliates Sundar Pichai in first class. The first class cabin was still, the kind of quiet that comes just before a storm. Michelle Turner stood frozen, her mind reeling from the revelation. The whispers of passengers turned into a low hum, like a wave building strength before crashing onto the shore. Ethan's voice echoed in her mind. "That's Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google." Her face turned pale as Sundar Pichai rose from his seat, his calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around him. His voice, gentle yet firm, cut through the tension. "It's okay," he said to Michelle. "We all make mistakes." There was no bitterness, no anger, only a quiet grace that made her shame burn even deeper. The flight attendant at the front of the cabin stepped forward, her voice trembling as she addressed the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. Mr. Pichai, on behalf of our airline, we extend our deepest apologies." Sundar simply nodded, offering a soft smile. "Thank you. Let's focus on a safe flight." But the damage was done. Michelle felt the weight of 100 eyes on her, judgment heavy in the air. The lesson was stark. In a world where appearances deceive, humility and respect are the true markers of class. If this story moved you, show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing for more real-life tales that challenge our perceptions. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been judged unfairly? Let's start a conversation that promotes empathy and understanding. If this resonates with you, drop a 1 in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. The early morning sun bathed Los Angeles International Airport in a soft, golden light. Rays of sunlight filtered through the massive glass windows, casting long shadows across the polished floors. The bustling terminal thrummed with life. Tired travelers shuffled through security lines, families reunited with tearful hugs, and professionals in tailored suits tapped furiously on their phones. The steady hum of announcements played in the background, blending into the chorus of rolling suitcases and muted conversations. Beyond the terminal's organized chaos, the first-class cabin of Flight 237 to Chicago gleamed with understated luxury. Plush leather seats, polished wood accents, and crystal glasses stood in perfect alignment. This was Michelle Turner's realm, a space where order and elegance reigned. Every detail was meticulously arranged, from the perfectly folded blankets to the selection of artisanal chocolates nestled on each tray. The quiet elegance of first class set the stage for a journey none of its passengers would soon forget. Michelle Turner, at 32, had carved a respected niche for herself as a senior flight attendant. Known for her sharp eye and impeccable standards, Michelle had become something of a legend on long-haul flights. She believed first-class service wasn't merely about comfort. It was about maintaining an image of exclusivity. The leather seats, the gourmet meals, and the quiet attentiveness of the crew were all pieces of a carefully crafted experience, and Michelle was its gatekeeper. Beneath her polished exterior, however, lingered unconscious biases. She prided herself on her intuition, believing she could discern who belonged in first class just by looking at them. To her, appearances often spoke volumes, and she rarely questioned her judgments. In stark contrast stood Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google. His presence was unassuming, his demeanor calm. He moved with the kind of quiet confidence that didn't demand attention but inevitably drew it. Dressed simply in jeans and a plain black t-shirt, Sundar carried only a worn leather laptop bag. His modest attire was a deliberate choice, a reflection of his values and his belief that status wasn't defined by clothing, but by character. Meanwhile, in the terminal, Ethan Myers, a 28-year-old tech entrepreneur, clutched his boarding pass with a mix of anticipation and nervous energy. Heading to a conference in Chicago, he was thrilled not only for the networking opportunities, but also because his idol, Sundar Pichai, would be the keynote speaker. Ethan's admiration for Sundar wasn't solely about his success. It was about his humility and leadership. Spotting Sundar in the terminal, Ethan's pulse quickened. He nudged his colleague, whispering, "That's Sundar Pichai. I can't believe he's on our flight." Have you ever been judged unfairly because of how you look or what you wear? Share your story in the comments below. Your voice matters. Your experiences can inspire others and bring to light how often appearances can mislead us. Let's create a community of empathy and understanding together. As Michelle moved through the first-class cabin, her practiced smile greeted each passenger with the warmth of routine hospitality. She straightened pillows, smoothed out blankets, and adjusted the pristine crystal glasses on the tray tables. Everything needed to be perfect. Her reputation depended on it. Her attention shifted as passengers began boarding. A stream of tailored suits, designer handbags, and polished shoes filled the aisle. Michelle offered each traveler a practiced nod and a perfectly timed "welcome aboard." She barely needed to glance at the boarding passes. Experience had trained her to recognize first-class passengers instinctively, or so she thought. Then, Sundar Pichai stepped into the cabin. Michelle's smile wavered. Her eyes drifted over his simple attire, his plain laptop bag, the absence of any luxury branding. She hesitated, her intuition whispering doubt. Was he in the right place? She exchanged a quick glance with Emily, the junior attendant, whose own expression mirrored a hint of confusion. Michelle's mind raced. As Sundar approached his seat, he ceased to exist. One of the best seats, she thought, her internal alarm bells ringing. As Sundar settled into his seat, slipping his bag under the chair, Michelle leaned closer to Emily, her voice a hushed whisper. "Did you double-check his boarding pass?" Emily nodded, a touch of uncertainty in her response. "Yes, everything's in order." Michelle's unease deepened. She had been in the industry long enough to trust her instincts, and something about Sundar didn't fit her picture of a first-class passenger. She tried to focus on her tasks, but her eyes kept drifting back to Sundar, whose only request so far had been a glass of plain water. Beneath the surface of routine hospitality, a subtle tension began to build. Michelle felt it, and so did a few of the more perceptive passengers. The story that would unfold was still veiled in the ordinary, but the first threads of drama had already begun to unravel. Michelle moved gracefully through the narrow aisle, her every gesture polished and precise. Her smile remained unwavering as sharply dressed passengers filed into first class, their expensive colognes and soft murmurs filling the air. She greeted them with practiced warmth, a touch on the shoulder here, a kind word there. This was her domain, and she ruled it with a subtle, almost regal authority. But as Sundar Pichai approached, Michelle's demeanor shifted. Her smile tightened, and her posture became more rigid. She extended her hand for his boarding pass, a gesture she hadn't bothered with for the other passengers. "Good morning, sir. May I see your ticket again?" she asked, her tone still polite, but underscored with a trace of doubt. Sundar offered a gentle smile, his calm eyes meeting hers without a hint of annoyance. He handed over his pass, and she studied it more closely than necessary, her brow knitting ever so slightly. Satisfied, but still unsure, she returned it and stepped aside, allowing him to pass. "Thank you," Sundar said softly, slipping into his seat and tucking his modest laptop bag beneath it. His movements were unhurried, a stark contrast to the polished hustle of the other passengers. From a few rows back, Ethan Myers watched the exchange with growing curiosity. He leaned toward his colleague, a quiet urgency in his voice. "I think that's Sundar Pichai," he whispered, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. His colleague glanced up, recognition slowly dawning as they observed Sundar's simple demeanor. Michelle continued her pre-fleet routine, but a subtle edge had entered her actions. When the pre-fleet drink service began, she moved through the aisle with a tray of sparkling champagne flutes, offering each passenger a glass with a bright, practiced smile. Yet, when she reached Sundar, her smile faltered. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" she asked. "Just water, please," Sundar replied, his voice gentle. Michelle hesitated for a fraction of a second. She set down a plain plastic cup of water, the only non-crystal vessel on her tray. "Here you go," she said, the edge of formality slipping into indifference. Sundar accepted the water with a nod, seemingly unfazed, but a few of the nearby passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Ethan frowned, his brow knitting as he noticed the subtle disparity. When the cabin lights dimmed and the flight settled into its cruising altitude, Michelle made her rounds with blankets. Each was a soft, woven blend, rolled neatly with a satin ribbon. She leaned over a passenger in a designer suit, draping the blanket over him as he slipped into a comfortable slumber. When she reached Sundar, he looked up with a polite expression. "Could I get a blanket, please?" Michelle paused, the request hanging between them. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the blanket. "These are for first-class passengers only," she said quietly, her voice not quite matching the level of service she had provided to others. Sundar's expression did not change. He nodded slowly, a thoughtful look crossing his face. "Understood," he replied, turning back to his laptop without another word. Ethan's eyes widened and he exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Did she just say—" His voice trailed off, the disbelief plain on his face. His colleague pressed a finger to his lips, signaling caution, but the tension had already settled into the air. Michelle moved on, her steps a little quicker, her expression unreadable. She sensed the shift, the quiet judgment of those who had witnessed the exchange. The plane hummed along its path through the sky, but beneath the polished surface of first class, a story was already unfolding, one that would soon reach a breaking point. Michelle moved through the first-class cabin with a practiced air of control, but a shadow of uncertainty clung to her every step. She found reasons to pass by Sundar's seat repeatedly, adjusting a light here, offering a napkin there, but each time her gaze lingered on him just a bit too long. Her expression, once smooth and professional, now bore a faint crease of suspicion. She leaned into the galley where Emily, the junior flight attendant, was organizing a tray of refreshments. "Have you checked his ticket again?" Michelle whispered, her voice low but edged with tension. Emily hesitated, her hands stilling over a row of water bottles. "I did. It's all in order, Michelle. He's definitely supposed to be here." Michelle's lips pressed into a thin line. "It just feels off. You know how important first-class standards are. We can't let anyone take advantage." Emily glanced over her shoulder, her expression a mix of confusion and unease. "I think he's fine. He hasn't asked for anything unusual, just water." Michelle huffed, brushing off the comment. "Stay alert. We need to make sure everyone is comfortable. The real first-class passengers shouldn't feel uneasy." As Michelle slipped back into the aisle, Sundar remained the picture of calm. His fingers moved steadily over his laptop keyboard, his focus unwavering despite the subtle storm brewing around him. His demeanor was a quiet anchor amid the orchestrated chaos of the cabin. Where Michelle's movements were sharp and increasingly erratic, Sundar's were measured and serene. Inside, Michelle wrestled with conflicting emotions. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong, but a quieter, nagging voice in the back of her mind whispered doubts she didn't want to acknowledge. Was this about him not fitting into her preconceived image of a first-class passenger, or was it something more uncomfortable? She had always considered herself fair and professional, but as the moments ticked by, an unsettling realization began to creep in. Her behavior wasn't about protocol, it was about prejudice. If this story is resonating with you, take a moment to hit that like button. It not only supports the channel, but also helps spread this important message of respect and equality. Michelle's internal dialogue churned, a storm beneath her composed exterior. She wanted to be right, to prove her instincts were as sharp as ever, but with every glance at Sundar's quiet composure, her certainty frayed. Her professional image, the mask she had worn for years, began to slip. She was no longer just a flight attendant, ensuring comfort and safety. She was becoming the source of discomfort, and the weight of that truth sat heavily on her chest. A sudden shudder rippled through the plane, and the seatbelt sign chimed sharply. The cabin lights flickered as turbulence gripped the aircraft, sending trays rattling and passengers clutching their armrests. Michelle, mid-aisle with a tray of freshly brewed coffee, lost her balance. The The steaming liquid arced through the air, splattering across a passenger's crisp white shirt. "Oh my God," the passenger gasped, his voice a mix of shock and pain as the hot coffee soaked into his clothes. Michelle stumbled forward, her polished composure unraveling. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her hand still gripping the empty tray. Before anyone else could react, Sundar rose from his seat, his movement smooth and deliberate. His voice, calm and reassuring, cut through the rising hum of unease. "Here, let me help." He guided Michelle gently to the side, his hand steadying her arm. "Emily, could you bring some cold water and towels?" he called back to the galley. His tone was gentle but assertive, and Emily sprang into action, her face a mix of concern and relief. Sundar knelt beside the passenger, offering a reassuring smile. "It's okay, just take deep breaths, we'll get this cleaned up." His hands moved with quiet efficiency, dabbing at the coffee stain while the turbulence ebbed away. The cabin seemed to draw a collective breath, the fear dissipating as quickly as it had come. For a moment, it appeared that the situation had been diffused, but as Sundar stood, Michelle's face hardened. She stepped forward, her posture regaining its rigid form. "Sir, I need you to return to your seat immediately," she said, her voice laced with a forced calm. Sundar blinked, his expression unreadable. "I was only trying to help." "Helping is not your job," Michelle snapped, the veneer of professionalism peeling back to reveal a mix of frustration and defensiveness. "There are protocols to follow. First-class passengers are expected to remain seated during turbulence." Sundar's expression remained steady, but a hint of disappointment shadowed his eyes. "I understand. I just didn't want anyone to get hurt." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "That's our responsibility. Please sit down." In the row behind, Ethan's hands tightened around his armrests. His eyes darted between Michelle's rigid stance and Sundar's calm demeanor. "We need to say something," he whispered to his colleague, his voice strained with disbelief. "She has no idea who he is." His colleague nodded slowly, a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. "Maybe she'll figure it out," he murmured, but the unease remained. The rest of the cabin had fallen into a heavy silence. Passengers watched the exchange with a mix of confusion and discomfort. The warmth that Sundar had brought to the situation was now replaced by a chill that hung in the air, a tension that clung to every breath. And in the eye of the storm, Michelle stood firm, not realizing how close she was to losing control of the narrative unfolding around her. Michelle retreated to the galley, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. She fumbled with the coffee pot, her hands shaking as the warm ceramic slipped against her damp palms. Emily approached, her expression a mix of concern and caution. "Are you okay?" Emily asked softly, her eyes darting back toward the cabin where Sundar had quietly resumed his seat. Michelle forced a brittle smile, her lips barely moving. "I'm fine. It's just, some people think the rules don't apply to them." She didn't specify who, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Her voice dropped, a sharp edge slicing through her words. "I've seen it before. They think because they have money or status, they can do whatever they want." Emily's brow furrowed, a shadow of doubt crossing her face. "But he was just helping. The passenger was burned." Michelle's jaw tightened. "That's not the point. We have procedures for a reason. He overstepped." Out in the cabin, passengers whispered behind their hands, their eyes flitting between Sundar and the closed curtain of the galley. The man who had been scalded with coffee now wore a blanket over his stained shirt, his expression filled with gratitude as he nodded to Sundar. Other passengers, having witnessed the scene, exchanged glances that carried more weight than words. Ethan leaned over to his colleague, his voice low but urgent. "Did you hear that?" She said, "Some people think rules don't apply to them." What is she getting at? His colleague sighed, his shoulders sagging. "It's not right. She's making assumptions. I think it's more about what she sees than what's real." The air in the cabin had turned thick with unspoken judgments and rising discomfort. Michelle's words, meant only for Emily, had slipped through the thin curtain, seeping into the consciousness of those around her. The flight had become more than just a journey through the sky. It was now a silent battleground of perceptions. And the lines between right and wrong were beginning to blur. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness. If you've ever experienced or witnessed a similar situation, share it below. Your stories help create a community of empathy and support. Michelle smoothed her uniform, each gesture a practiced motion meant to steady her frayed nerves. She stepped back into the aisle, her gaze honing in on Sundar. His calm demeanor, his quiet presence, it all seemed to mock her growing sense of unease. She had spent years cultivating her intuition, learning to spot those who didn't belong, and yet, every instinct she had felt wrong in his presence. She stopped by his seat, a carefully curated smile on her lips. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice carrying a polite edge. "I wanted to ensure you're comfortable. If you find first class a bit overwhelming, perhaps business class might be a better fit for you." Her words hung in the air, their meaning sharp and unmistakable. A few heads turned, eyes widening as the implications settled over the cabin. Sundar looked up slowly, his expression calm, but his eyes betraying a flicker of disappointment. "Thank you," he said, his voice even. "But I'm quite comfortable where I am." Michelle hesitated, the tightness in her chest pressing against her composure. "I understand, but—" A voice broke through the thick silence, cutting her words in half. "That's Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Google." Ethan stood, his face a mixture of disbelief and righteous anger. His voice, though not loud, carried through the cabin, rippling across the polished wood and leather seats. The quiet murmurs of passengers ceased, replaced by a stunned stillness. Phones emerged, discreetly capturing the moment, as the weight of recognition settled in. Michelle's face drained of color. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She blinked rapidly, as if trying to clear a fog from her vision. I didn't realize." Ethan's expression softened, but only slightly. "That's the problem, isn't it? You didn't realize because you didn't look beyond what you expected to see." Her hands trembled as she reached for Sundar's ID, her fingers barely gripping the edge of the card. She read the name, the letters burning into her mind. Her own voice echoed back at her, a hollow sound against the truth that loomed over her. Everything she had thought, every judgment she had made, collapsed around her. The reality hit her with the force of a tidal wave, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. The carefully constructed world she had built on assumptions and intuition crumbled, and beneath it lay the harsh truth. She had let prejudice guide her actions, and now there was no hiding from the consequences. A ripple of disbelief spread through the cabin, starting as a soft murmur and growing into a wave of hushed conversations. Smartphones were raised cautiously, screens glowing as passengers captured the unfolding drama. Some whispered among themselves, while others stared openly, their expressions a blend of shock and curiosity. Ethan remained standing, his eyes fixed on Michelle. His disbelief had hardened into something sharper, edged with disappointment. "How could you not know?" he asked, his voice tight. "You treated him like he didn't belong, all because of how he looks?" Michelle's throat constricted, her voice reduced to a fragile whisper. I didn't know." The words fell flat, offering no solace, no redemption. She felt the weight of every stare, each one a judgment of her own making. Her hands twisted together, seeking an anchor in the storm of her own mistakes. Sundar sat quietly, his expression a mask of calm that only heightened the contrast with the chaos around him. He hadn't moved, hadn't demanded anything. His silence was not weakness, but strength, an unspoken testament to the power of dignity in the face of prejudice. In the silence that followed, the truth hung heavy in the air. It was more than a revelation of identity. It was an exposure of assumptions, a mirror held up to bias. The plane continued its steady path through the sky, but nothing else remained on course. If this twist surprised you, let us know with a comment. Sometimes, the truth is not just stranger than fiction, but also a powerful reminder of why judging by appearances is so dangerous. The cabin's speakers crackled to life, drawing every gaze upward. The captain's voice, steady and composed, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I'd like to take a moment to address a situation that has unfolded on this flight. On behalf of the airline, I offer our sincerest apologies to Mr. Sundar Pichai and to all passengers who may have felt uncomfortable. We strive to provide an environment of respect and dignity for everyone, regardless of appearance or status. Thank you for your understanding and cooperation." The announcement settled over the cabin like a blanket, muffling the lingering whispers. Passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others still processing the magnitude of what had happened. Michelle stood frozen, the captain's words ringing in her ears. Before she could collect herself, the captain appeared at the edge of the first-class section, his face a mask of professionalism, tempered by a hard edge. He beckoned her into the galley, his expression leaving no room for argument. As soon as they were behind the curtain, his voice dropped, the warmth gone. "This isn't the first complaint, Michelle." Her lips moved soundlessly. I thought..." "That's the problem," he cut her off. "You thought, you assumed, and you acted on it. Do you understand the severity of this? Not just for you, but for our entire crew, our airline?" Her cheeks burned, not just from his reprimand, but from the truth embedded in his words. She nodded, the motions small and weak. "I understand." "Do you?" He sighed, his shoulders heavy with the weight of the situation. "You need to take a long, hard look at yourself, Michelle. This isn't just about one mistake. It's about a pattern. Fix it." When the captain left, Michelle remained in the galley, the hum of the plane swallowing the silence around her. She gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles pale against the steel. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale scraping against the walls of her throat. She turned slowly, her gaze catching on the small silver panel of the coffee machine. The distorted reflection staring back at her wasn't the composed professional she had built herself to be. This woman was different, her eyes wide and haunted, her mouth drawn into a tight line of remorse. Memories flashed through her mind. A young woman in casual clothes she had overlooked for service, an older man with a worn jacket she had dismissed too quickly, a family whose language barrier had tested her patience. Small moments, forgotten quickly by her, but perhaps not by those on the receiving end of her judgment. Her chest tightened as realization crept over her. This wasn't a one-time lapse. It was a thread woven through her career, a series of small, invisible injuries inflicted by her own biases. She had always prided herself on her intuition, on her ability to read people. But now she saw it clearly. Her intuition had been clouded, not by experience, but by prejudice. The reflection held her gaze, unflinching and raw. She had to face it, had to understand that the person looking back at her was not the person she wanted to be. And as the plane flew steadily toward its destination, Michelle felt the ground shift beneath her, a turbulence far greater than anything she had ever felt in the air. Michelle drew in a shaky breath, the cool air of the galley doing little to calm the storm inside her. She smoothed her uniform, an almost instinctive attempt to regain some semblance of composure. Her feet felt leaden as she moved down the aisle, each step a test of her resolve. The whispers had quieted, but the weight of 100 watchful eyes pressed against her. She stopped at Sundar's seat, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. He looked up, his expression open yet unreadable. His calmness, the unwavering steadiness of his gaze, only deepened her sense of shame. "Mr. Pichai," she began, her voice faltering. I owe you an apology. I let my assumptions guide me, and I see now how wrong that was. You deserved respect from the moment you stepped on board, and I failed to give you that." Her voice wavered, and she swallowed hard, forcing herself to hold his gaze. "I'm truly sorry." Sundar's expression softened, but his words were measured. "Apology accepted. We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do next." The simplicity of his statement struck her with the force of truth. He wasn't dismissing her actions, nor was he condemning her. His forgiveness wasn't an eraser for her wrongdoing, but an invitation to change. It was a reminder that redemption lay not in empty words, but in meaningful actions. Her shoulders dropped slightly, a burden lifted by the quiet strength of his response. "Thank you," she whispered, the gratitude in her voice edged with determination. "I won't forget this." As she stepped back, the atmosphere in the cabin shifted. The tension eased, and a sense of quiet understanding settled over the passengers. Michelle's journey toward redemption had only just begun, but the first step had been taken. If you've been moved by this story, consider subscribing. We share powerful stories like this to remind us all of the strength in humility, empathy, and growth. Together, we can create a space where every story is a lesson and every voice is valued. Months had passed since the fateful flight, but the lessons learned in that narrow cabin continued to echo far beyond the skies. The airline responded swiftly, launching a new bias awareness program designed to train staff on recognizing and mitigating their own prejudices. The initiative was not just a corporate response to a PR incident, but a genuine effort to change the culture of customer service. Michelle became an integral part of the program. At first, the idea of standing in front of new hires and seasoned professionals alike made her palms sweat and her voice tremble, but she understood the importance of sharing her story, the good, the bad, and the deeply uncomfortable truths. Her vulnerability became a powerful tool for change. She recounted the moment she realized her biases had turned her into the very source of discomfort she had sworn to prevent. She stood at the front of conference rooms filled with flight attendants, gate agents, and airline executives, her voice steady and clear. "I thought I was maintaining first-class standards," she would say, "but what I was really doing was building walls. I learned that true service is not about who you expect someone to be, but about seeing who they truly are." Her story became the centerpiece of the training sessions, a real-world example of how biases could cloud judgment and how humility could break through the fog. She didn't shy away from her mistakes. Instead, she dissected them, showing others how to turn moments of failure into opportunities for growth. Meanwhile, Sundar Pichai quietly supported the airline's efforts. He penned a letter to the airline's CEO, expressing his appreciation for their proactive steps and, more importantly, for Michelle's courage. "True leadership," he wrote, "is not about avoiding mistakes, but about confronting them head-on." Michelle Turner's willingness to change is a powerful example of the impact empathy can have, not only in customer service, but in every aspect of our lives. The story of the flight, the apology, and the subsequent redemption spread beyond the airline industry. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a case study in transformative leadership. Social media buzzed with discussions about the importance of empathy, and customer service professionals from other industries reached out, asking for insights into the new training program. Michelle's story became a beacon of change. It wasn't just about one person's redemption, but about the ripple effect that genuine change could create. From high school classrooms discussing bias to corporate boardrooms revising their training manuals, the message was clear. Respect is not about status or appearance. It's about recognizing the inherent worth in every person. In a world quick to judge and slow to understand, Michelle's journey served as a reminder that redemption is always possible. And sometimes, the strongest voices come from those who once made the biggest mistakes. Have you ever found yourself judging someone too quickly? What helped you see them differently? Share your experiences in the comments. We can all learn from each other. Sometimes, the smallest stories hold the biggest lessons, and your voice might inspire someone else to look beyond appearances and embrace empathy. This story isn't just about one flight attendant's mistake. It's about all of us. We live in a world filled with first impressions, snap judgments, and assumptions. But imagine the change we could create if we all chose empathy first. What if, instead of looking at someone and categorizing them by what they wear, where they come from, or how they speak, we paused and considered their story? Michelle's journey from prejudice to redemption is a powerful reminder that every mistake is an opportunity to grow. Sundar's quiet grace under pressure shows us the strength of humility. Together, they taught not just a cabin full of passengers, but an entire industry what true first-class service looks like: respect, dignity, and kindness for all. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might need this reminder today. And, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Together, we can build a community that values every story, every voice, and every person. Your support helps us continue to share stories that inspire change and remind us all of the power of understanding and forgiveness. Thank you for being a part of this journey with us.